On behalf of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's virtual program featuring presidential speechwriters from both sides of the aisle. And I want to personally apologize for my voice. I am losing my voice, but I'm going to try to project so everybody can hear me. So word choice and rhetoric from the President of the United States impacts not only Americans, but our allies and enemies abroad. With the changes in communications, technology, and the advent of the 24/7 news cycle, our expectations over what and how we hear from the most powerful leader in the world have changed. We know that the president's words can calm a nation in a time of crisis. It can move a nation in times of emergency. And it's an incredible tool, both here at home for our own politics, but for our foreign policy abroad. And we all know that Senator Kennedy was famous for his booming rhetoric, whether it was on the Senate floor or in speeches across the country, or his famous speeches to the Democratic National Convention, that words, in addition to actions and deeds, go down in history books for their meanings and impact. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel of speechwriters. First, Ambassador Carolyn Curiel is a recognized journalist and educator who served as United States Ambassador to Belize and in the White House as senior presidential speechwriter and special assistant to the president for President Clinton. She wrote on a wide range of issues, including his noted speeches on race. They included remarks in Memphis to Black religious leaders in November of '93, the speech originally to have been on, was supposed to be on the North American Free Trade Agreement, and thankfully she successfully argued to shift its focus. And after delivering his Mend It, Don't End It speech on affirmative action at the National Archives on July 19th, 1995, remember this speech well, President Clinton said, "She made history this afternoon. Carolyn Curiel personally helped me craft my affirmative action speech. She had more to do with drafting it than anyone else, and she is the first person of color, and more importantly, the first Latina in the history of our country to write speeches for the president. And it may be that the one that she wrote today will go down as one of the 2 or 3 most important I've ever delivered." Second, we have Cody Keenan, former colleague of mine, who has written for President Barack Obama since 2007, rising from a campaign intern in Chicago to White House chief speechwriter to Obama's post-presidential collaborator. Over 8 years in the White House, their joint efforts were compared to the works of Abraham Lincoln. They were described as the, quote, "I have a dream" speech for the 21st century, and categorized even by prominent Republicans as speeches that every child should read in school. Cody was nicknamed the Springsteen of the Obama White House, even though he can't play an instrument. And I think we need to explore that name a little bit further in this session. And his passions for public service and gripping rhetoric were sharpened as a young aide to Senator Ted Kennedy. And today, Cody sits on the board of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. And then finally, we have John McConnell, who served more than 10 years on White House staff in 2 different administrations. As a senior speechwriter for President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney, he was part of the 3-person team responsible for all of the 43rd President's major addresses, including the historic speech to the joint session of Congress after September 11th, 2001, and 5 State of the Union messages. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator for the evening, Tamara Keith. Tamara Keith has been a White House correspondent for NPR since 2014 and co-hosts the NPR Politics Podcast, which is the top political news podcast in America and one of my favorites. Keith focuses on the Biden administration's response to the COVID-19 crisis. She chronicled the Trump administration from day one, helping us all make sense of the unorthodox presidency, from early morning tweets to executive orders to investigations. She covered the final 2 years of the Obama presidency and also the 2016 presidential campaign covering Hillary Clinton. So again, thank you for joining us. And I'm now going to turn it over to Tamara to get the conversation started.
Excellent. And I think before we get into the serious stuff, maybe we can do just a little fun to help us all get to know you better. So let's start with Cody. What's the Springsteen thing?
The Springsteen thing is nonsense. I mean, It's true, but it's mostly because I just listen to them all the time. And the easiest things to write were always, sort of parables of hardworking Americans and speeches at auto plants. And those are always kind of my sweet spot. So that's unearned. Bruce Springsteen is America's greatest poet.
Indeed, indeed. Yes. So John, why don't you tell us about the time that Vice President Cheney called and told you that he had gotten you both in trouble?
Well, one afternoon, my phone rang, and as Cody and Carolyn know, when the president or vice president calls you, there's that little window on the phone that tells you who was calling. It just says POTUS or V POTUS. There was V POTUS. I picked up the phone. I said, "Sir," he said in that rich, deep Dick Cheney baritone, he said, "John, I got us into some trouble." And I said, "Oh." And he proceeded to tell me that the president and Mrs. Bush had decided to leave Washington right away to go to the funeral of Pope John Paul II. The president had been scheduled to speak the next night at the radio and TV correspondents dinner in Washington. As my colleagues also know, the president has to give a funny speech. So Cheney says to me, "I've got to go there tomorrow in the president's stead, and I've got to say funny things for 10 minutes. And then he says, "I don't do funny." And I said, "Well, sir, actually, you'll do a fine job up there. And you just let me call my colleague Matthew Scully, and the next day or so, we'll get a speech ready for you." And the lesson is, number one, he was very funny. He's got very good comic timing. Number two is, just generally, if you work in White House speech writing, you've got to be ready for anything, anytime.
Indeed. And Carolyn, I think you also wrote some speeches for those terrible, wonderful, whatever you want to call them, Washington dinners.
Oh, they were terrible. No question about it. We had a very small staff of speechwriters. There were 3 writers at the beginning of the administration. I was the one outsider, not a holdover from the campaign. And we would sit around in a circle, 3 speechwriters compared to, what was it, 9 or 12 for his predecessor. And so it was a matter of volunteering, and who doesn't like comedy? I grew up on really terrific sitcoms and other things. So I put up my hand to write the speech, and it went very well. It was the radio TV correspondents dinner as well. So John, I did not remember that story of yours, but it's hilarious. And what I did basically was a lot of, that can only be called Borscht Belt humor. So it was a surprise hit. And the next day the president calls me. He's en route to Atlanta on Air Force One. And he says, "Pretty funny stuff, Carolyn. What have you got for me for the gridiron?" And I'm thinking, wait a second. I didn't sign up to be a comedy writer, but I had absolutely nothing planned. So all I could think of, top of my head, was, "Okay, can you keep your lips warm for the saxophone?" Dead silence. I probably could have thought of another way to say that, a better way to say that. And he comes back and he says, "I will." So I run over to the communication office to let them know. So, and they're talking about the prior night's comedy address. And they said, "Oh, we're talking about gridiron." And I said, "Oh, great. He'll play the saxophone." They said, "No, no, no. Never, ever, ever ask him to play the saxophone. He has to rehearse. He's not going to be happy about it. It's just a really, really bad idea." And I said, "Done, sorry." So he took the stage at the gridiron as a surprise in a skit, wearing black sequin tails, and played on his saxophone, "Yakety yak, don't talk back."
So this was great. And from, within minutes, we are going to be talking about the decline of democracy. So I'm glad that we had a little fun to start. And I want to move into the speech writing process. And I'm hoping that each of you could talk about a speech that you worked on that was really memorable or that you're really proud of, but also give us some insight into the process. I assume every president is different in the process that they wanted. Who wants to go first? John?
Yeah, the process is similar in the same in the same few basics. That is, the speechwriting office generates a draft that is then sent to the staff secretary, who is an assistant to the president, who circulates it to the senior staff in the White House for review and comment, due in the speechwriting office, usually the same day. And then you have your fact checkers. We had very strict fact checking in our office. We actually had a fact checking department of speechwriting. And then the polished draft, footnoted by the fact checkers, goes to the president for his review, and then he will start to make his imprint on it. President Bush was a very serious editor. Speeches generally took 4 to 8 days. That was our general expectation. But after September 11th, of course, we had a series of speeches that had to be put together really quickly, including the speech that Friday to the service at the National Cathedral, and then the speech to Congress on Thursday, September 20th. That speech, we got the assignment, my colleagues Mike Gerson, Matthew Scully, and I got that assignment on Monday morning, September 17th, and we were told that the president wanted a draft by the end of that day, and our objections to the contrary went unheeded, and we simply had to get a draft to him by the end of that day, and we did. But that was the rare instance when you had to turn around something very fast. But it was we had very good guidance on the front end from the president. He was the one who gave us the framework for the speech, which was to pose questions that the American people are asking. And because the president gave us such a very good, firm outline to start with, we were able to finish the draft in a single day.
You know, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Stephanie Grisham, the former Trump press secretary, about her book. And the thing from that interview that stood out most to me is she was talking about the president, former President Trump, gave an Oval Office address on, I think it was March 11th. Basically the day that Tom Hanks got COVID and everybody in America went, oh my God, this thing is real. And she said that they didn't decide that they were doing an Oval Office address until 3 p.m. and the speech was at 8. And now that I hear you talking about your process and being, you know, alarmed at having only 3 days, I think maybe her story is even more shocking than I imagined.
Well, I'm sure my colleagues will agree that is unimaginable, and you're not going to have a good result. I mean, we had to do a speech for President Bush in 4 hours once, and that was when we lost 7 astronauts on the space shuttle Columbia. Of course, the country's waiting for the president to say something, but it's not going to be a long speech. It's going to be brief, but very quick turnaround. The idea that a major Oval Office address is not even going to be decided on until, what'd you say, 3 in the afternoon?
Yeah.
You know, it's unimaginable. You're not going to get a good result with a process like that, in my opinion.
And
Doesn't
there
sound
was,
like it was process.
and there was confusion after the speech where all of us reporters were scrambling saying, what did he just announce? So Cody, why don't you take a turn at talking about like the process, but also like a moment that stands out?
Sure. Just to add to what you were saying, Tamara, you know, it wasn't just chaos in the process of President Trump's speech. You looked abroad and you had thousands of people showing up at the Paris airport because they didn't give good guidance in the speech. And that's why you don't rush these things. Not to pile
I mean,
on.
this panel is called Why Presidential Rhetoric Matters. I guess we're getting at that here.
For something like that, you have to be precise. Our process was similar to John's, but probably a little more condensed. You know, we typically took 3 days per speech. And we actually excised staff secretary from the process, not to make you guys too jealous, Carolyn and John, but we circulated the speeches ourselves as speechwriters. Once we thought it was ready, we sent it around to senior staff. We took their edits and decided which ones to make and which not to. And then we sent it to the president for his overnight book. So that actually saved us a lot of time. I don't know how you dealt with other people deciding what edits to make and not, but we kind of kept that to ourselves. One, I think, you know, you're talking about a specific speech, and I should say here, first of all, the president was, you know, he was almost first and foremost a writer, and he was intimately involved in it. In many ways, he saw it as a collaborative relationship. And I think one of our best speeches was actually a day I got to circumvent the process entirely. 2 days before he was supposed to speak at Selma, Washington shut down for a snowstorm. But I went to the office and just spent the day, President Obama and I just spent the day shuttling drafts back and forth to each other because nobody was there. There was kind of a skeleton staff, but he had no meetings. So we just had all day to work on a speech and pass 5 drafts back and forth that, each one made the other better. So no process, in my opinion, gives the best speeches. With apologies to everyone who works at the White House.
I'm completely envious of you, Cody, for having that as your setup, because we did have process as well. As not the same as you, John, but our process was sometimes it was hair on fire, but not to the degree that we just heard about from the prior administration. The process was typically policy driving, policy and scheduling driving what the topics would be. And I'm going to illuminate a little bit more on the Memphis speech, because it's the one time that I felt I absolutely, I had to do something to intervene, and could have possibly lost my job, I suppose, but did not, mercifully. The speech was supposed to be about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was in November of '93. And I had been in the Oval a couple of times leading up to this. Our lead time was for this, I want to say it was not quite a week. And the president in the Oval had said a couple of times, he pointed out that there had been a story on the front page of the Washington Post, written by a young woman I actually knew. I had been at the Post. And it was about an 11-year-old girl, I believe she was 11, planning her funeral because of the violence in her neighborhood. This is the dress I want to wear. This is the music I want played. It was just a gut-wrenching story. A tremendous impact on the president. He talked about it a few times. And so we're sitting in our little circle, and I'm hearing a speech to the convocation of the Church of God in Christ in Memphis. I've never been to Memphis, didn't know anything about the church. So we started research. I put my hand up and we started our research. And we had a great research department headed up by Ann Walker. One of the first things I would do is ask about the history of the location, because sometimes there's something there, as there was for the affirmative action speech as well, where we played with the idea of the archives as this treasure box for our documents. So the history of that pulpit just struck me like a thunderbolt. Of course, it was the last pulpit of Martin Luther King before he was assassinated. And why was he in Memphis? Anyway, he was supporting strikers. I believe it was the sanitation workers. And so to go there and talk about the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was opposed by blue collar workers, unions, and these ministers, I'm assuming, was just not doable. And I couldn't get any traction. And so after a meeting, one of our several meetings, I went up to Bruce Lindsay, who would run it. Bruce was he was ostensibly the head of presidential personnel, but he was really the president's consigliere in a lot of ways. And his best friend, I think. And I explained to him, last pulpit from Martin Luther King, the president's interest in this violence in Black neighborhoods. And oh, by the way, NAFTA is not going to resonate. The church also had been founded in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so he wasn't going to stick to a script because he knew these bishops. So I said, it has to be talking points and it has to be about race. And Bruce looked down for a second and said, do it, I'll tell the president. And I did. And even on Air Force One on the way there, the policy people were arguing it still needs to be about NAFTA. A little bit was inserted about NAFTA, but that wasn't what the speech was about. Very few people remember that. But it was a little bit chilling until Bruce got into the car with me on the motorcade leaving. And he said, I think that went okay. What do you think? I was like, Yeah, I think so. That was all the president. Talking points. It was a guidepost for him, but he deserved just, he was like being visited by the Holy Ghost. It was just amazing.
So since we are on the topic of speeches about race, I wanted to ask Cody and John about this too. You both served presidents who gave important speeches at times when, you know, racial division was out in the open in the US. Of course, now it's way out in the open again. But Cody, you are finishing up a book about that period of time between the mass shooting at Mother Emanuel Church and his eulogy.
Yeah, my manuscript is due tomorrow, so I'll be playing a good old-fashioned all-nighter tonight. But I'm writing a book about, like you said, the 10 days between the shootings in Charleston and his eulogy in Charleston. So it's not a memoir. It's because a lot happened in that week. You know, people forget there was also a very public debate about the Confederate flag coming down across the South in public spaces, and the Affordable Care Act was upheld in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found a right to marriage equality. And then the president went and sang Amazing Grace. And kind of the one thread through all this is this question of, you know, who are we? You know, who are Americans and who gets to decide who belongs? There's this kind of contest to determine the true meaning of America that's been going on since our founding. And it's, you know, you've got the Bull Connor America on one side of the bridge in Selma that thinks America is only for one type of person, or you have kind of this larger, more cacophonous vision of America on the other side. And kind of the question at the heart of America is which is going to win out. So that's what the book is about. You know, obviously there'll be some fun stories about speechwriting interspersed in it, but you know, we thought about this stuff all the time. I mean, the first Black president, you have to, and that gave him unique opportunities, but also some unique obstacles when he was talking about race.
Was the Amazing Grace planned?
Yeah, people have asked that before. Like, I didn't write in the text, sing here. But he said, and this has been told before, we were on Marine One that morning heading to Andrews. He just finished a statement in the Rose Garden about marriage equality. And then Marine One came and we took off, and he was still working on the speech on board. And, you know, he stood up right before we landed and said, or just after we landed and said, you know, if it feels right, I might sing it, because we inserted the lyrics toward the end. And the first lady just kind of shook her head, and I hadn't slept in like 3 days, so I just kind of shrugged and said, you know, you do you, man. And I asked him afterwards, I was like, you knew you were going to do that, right? Because keep in mind, it was a memorial service, yes, but it was also the AME church, you know, Black church, and they had an organist playing, you know, during the remarks. They had a guy came in on the guitar during the remarks. People were singing and going praise. I mean, it was Sunday. It was technically a Friday, but it was Sunday. You're going to church. So I knew within about 2 minutes of seeing the crowd there that he was going to sing. And so before he did, he paused for about 12 seconds and just kind of looked down at his book. So I actually asked him afterwards, I was like, were you trying to build some dramatic effect? And he goes, no, man, you know, the thing about Amazing Grace is you got to start real low. Because once you get to a wretch like me, you're like up here, and I didn't want to squeal in front of the entire country.
Wow. John, you have a different moment when the country was grappling with who we are.
Well, when 9/11 happened, of course, it was so awful for the country. All at once, the American people were feeling shock, grief, anger, and fear. And the president was giving voice in his speeches during that time to all those feelings that the nation had. But it was also his role to reassure the nation that we were going to get through this. That we'd been attacked. There were enemies that we had to deal with, and we were going to do that. And we were not going to live in fear as a country. But at the same time, in our response to what had happened to our country, we were going to act in a manner consistent with our values. If to the extent that there was anyone thinking that the United States would overreact and would find itself or view itself as at war with a racial group, or more to the point, an entire religion. Those fears were unfounded because they were dealing with President George W. Bush, a genuinely decent man, a good-hearted man, who from those very early days said just the right things. And really, that's not a credit to his writers, except to the extent that we paid careful attention to the man himself and how he wanted to say things. And so it was a sensitive moment, but it passed with very little difficulty because of the way the president handled himself.
Just a note to our audience that we are going to want to take your questions in a few minutes. So if you do have questions, I think you put them in the Q&A section, and they will, through the magic of the internet, get to me, and I will ask them. The title of our talk mentions tweets, and even though I'd rather never think about Twitter ever again, I do want to ask you guys whether you think that Twitter has helped or hurt presidential communications, whether there is an art to the presidential tweet. And I will just say, as a reporter who for 4 years perfected the art of reading a tweet on the air, I have not had to read a tweet on the air in the last 9 months. There just has not been a tweet that created news. And I don't know whether that is good for President Biden or bad for President Biden, but I just would love all of your thoughts about presidential tweets.
Well, for myself, I do not think it is a net plus for presidential communications. I think there's the tendency nowadays to turn everything into a bite-sized piece is epitomized, of course, by Twitter. And I can't think of, I just say with confidence in general, I don't think anyone is better off in this country. Anyone is better informed in this country. Anyone has a better sense of the important issues facing the country and the distinctions, differences on those issues among people because of Twitter. I think it's just the opposite.
Yeah, all that is true. Simply put, I'd just say that speechwriting is thinking before you speak, and tweeting is speaking before you think. There's no nuance to it. You're wrong half the time. It's designed to make people angry and interact, whereas a speech is, if you do it right, designed to make people think, and hopefully even change their mind and lead them to a different direction. Well,
and another thing about that, one thing about speeches in modern life, too often there's a reaching for applause lines, and it's part of the system now. I like the kind of speech where you're able to go for great lengths, not interminably, but we'll go for even a page to draw people in and get them listening and thinking, as Cody was saying. But you have communications experts often, especially in politics, who say, no, it's got to have something, it's got to have an applause line every 2 paragraphs or something like that. So you're kind of pushing against that kind of thing as well.
Well, it's a little bit like electroshock therapy, right? I mean, people go to it because they're looking for something that will zing them. It'll do something that, I don't know, it's supposed to inform, of course, but that's not always going to be the case. And I'm pretty sure most people don't click if it says read full text here, so you get this little bit of something that doesn't really tell you much of anything. And then, of course, it morphed into something else entirely under the prior president, where it was used as a cudgel. And so less informing and more, of a disinformation and meanness about it. So it's a real mixed bag, but I think more than anything, what I find not useful for me is that it's a time waster. And there are so many other sources for some context and depth. And, you know, and where speeches themselves are concerned, it's, as my two colleagues here tonight have said, it's a matter of not just words, it's also feeling. It's also the ability of the particular president to communicate something that's deeper than words that would appear on a screen or a handheld or whatever paper. It's more. Speeches are living things that speak to a time, a place, and offer a vision. And you can't get that. The closest that any president may have come would have been the shortest speech in presidential history, and that would have been, of course, the Gettysburg Address. And I don't see Gettysburg getting any traction in tweets. 270 words, that would take what, maybe 5 screens, something like that.
It would be a short thread.
It would indeed.
So this gets me to something that, I mean, I think a lot of people are concerned about the current state of our democracy, about the polarization, about the alternate universes of truth and sort of the meaning of what democracy is supposed to be. And so I'm wondering whether you think that a president's words can damage our democracy, have damaged our democracy. And I also wonder if there is anything a president can say to actually repair it.
I mean, I think we've seen pretty clearly that there are words you can use to damage our democracy. I don't want to dwell on it, but you had the first ones that come to mind were, our last president denigrating pretty much anyone under the sun who wasn't a white man, standing next to Vladimir Putin and repudiating NATO. I mean, the list goes on, and it takes a toll and makes a difference. Hate crimes rose. Whatever, the list goes on. You certainly can. And I worry a lot about, we don't just reclaim our status in the world as soon as Joe Biden takes office. I mean, these are things that take time to earn back, and it's not just words, it's also like things like leaving our commitments and treaties and abandoning, other nations. But it can make a big difference. Getting it back is a lot harder. And the media environment makes it a lot harder. I think one place where we were a little more unfortunate than John and Carolyn was, John, you only had to deal with only the last 2 years did you have Facebook. And then Facebook and Twitter became a real problem, and they're becoming an even bigger problem. And no one's quite figured out how to use it in a productive way. President Trump used it to his own advantage in a lot of ways. It obviously didn't help him win re-election, but when your strategy is kind of to divide and conquer and make people as angry as possible and get rid of any sort of baseline of facts from which a democracy operates, Twitter can be a very powerful tool.
So President Clinton would say in his Arkansan way to audiences, any jackass could kick down a barn, but to build it back up takes a lot of thought, planning, and working together. And I think that metaphor applies to what was done with Twitter by the prior president. And yes, it did damage democracy. We're seeing that. And now we're seeing how the process to repair can be so slow, having to go through courts just to get records of what was actually done to try to thwart the people's will on January 6th. So, it's a hard turn that President Biden has gotten. He'll be known, I think, as a healing president, but the healing will not come quickly. And it's going to feel slow to some people. His ratings are coming down. I don't think it's particularly fair, but that's human nature. And we will see where the path leads us, but I don't expect overnight success.
Yeah, I was talking to some voters in Ohio, independent voters, who said that they are disappointed that, the healing hasn't come. But I don't know quite what a president can say, given the current polarization. I don't know, John, any thoughts?
Well, president's words do matter, and I think that every time a president gives a serious speech on a serious matter, it's a great opportunity. And I would just say to anyone of either party who's running for a president, especially in times like these, resist the impulse to try to hurt or provoke someone. If you believe in unity, sound like it. Take yes for an answer. You're the president, and a president can do a lot to make the country feel good, and to make even political people who disagree with the president politically feel as though they're viewed with respect. I think also this tendency nowadays towards shorthand has really gotten bad. If you look at President Obama's speech, the speech that made his career in Boston in 2004, when he said, "We're not red America and blue America, we're the United States of America." We have never as a country referred to ourselves in such terms. The problem is, I think, is that in 2000, when you had that 35-day recount, every night the map of the presidential electoral vote tally was on TV every night instead of one night. And people saw that map, that red and blue, red and blue, red and blue. And by the end of that period, people were saying red and blue America. The New York Times uses the terms red America and blue America in headlines. And what is Ohio? Red America? Blue America? Well, it's neither. We should not view ourselves in those terms. And to the extent that people in positions of influence use those terms, I think it damages the country. You do not hear Americans refer to themselves in such terms.
I'm turning now to some of the questions that we've gotten, and let's just say they aren't all easy. So let's start with this one. Do you think President Trump helped incite January 6th with his words to his supporters? And I would expand that to not just that speech on that day, but earlier too.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It sure seems like it. That seems to be their version of it.
All right, well, that was easier than I thought it would be. Let's move on. I want to, one of the questions that we got is sort of what it takes to be a speechwriter, and how you got to where you got. And Carolyn, why don't you start, because you're a woman of color in a field that is dominated by white dudes.
I am. And here's the interesting thing. Although some tried to tag me with disparagingly with the term Hispanic speechwriter, I was actually selected as part of a blind taste test. The White House in waiting, the Clinton White House in waiting, didn't know whom to hire really. And so they did a bit of a talent test. They asked a couple of dozen people across the United States to submit writing samples, and I didn't want to. Somebody put my name in, and they reached out to me. I had a contract with Ted Koppel, who I adore, at Nightline, and I did not want to leave him. And so I put off putting it in, but they called me a few times, and I thought, okay, I'll go ahead and do it. What they didn't tell me is they stripped off all identifying information on the writers, and then a panel sat down from the campaign, soon to be at the White House, and they chose the one they wanted. And it was just one, and they chose mine. And so I showed up at the White House for an interview the same day that Ted Koppel was there doing interviews for gays in the military. It was like a week after the inauguration. I hadn't told him that I was going there because I thought they were being polite, just to tell me, thanks, for submitting this. We're going in another direction, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't really want the job anyway. And so Ted saw me, and of course the gig was up, and I told him, and he said, oh, they don't have time to be polite here. They're going to offer you the job. You need to decide if you want to do it. And so I was offered the job. Ted went in to interview people on his topic and gave me an on-the-spot recommendation. So that's pretty much how that happened. But my life had been as a journalist. And while I thought working at the White House would be pretty neat, the timing for me wasn't at all what I expected.
John, how did you become a speechwriter?
Well,
was it American Idol style, or?
No, it's. I always tell people that when you get a position like this, it's not because there was a nationwide merit search It certainly wasn't the case in my situation. I had an opportunity to go to work for Vice President Dan Quayle in the summer of 1990. And I was just finishing up a clerkship with a federal judge in New York City and wanted to do something political early in my career. And as so often happens, A talks to B and B talks to C and C knows somebody. And I got this position. I was hired by Bill Crystal, who was Vice President Quayle's chief of staff. I didn't know Vice President Quayle, liked him, admired him, supported him, but didn't finally meet him until my second week writing speeches for him. We were introduced on Air Force Two.
That's a nice place to get introduced to somebody.
Well, you're right. He knows you're there for a reason.
Yeah, not a stowaway. Cody, how did you do this?
The short answer is I got my job through Stephanie Cutter, who introduced us tonight. The first speeches I ever wrote for somebody else were for Senator Kennedy. And she introduced me in 2007, early 2007, to John Favreau, who was Obama's chief speechwriter, actually his only speechwriter at the time. And they'd worked together on the John Kerry campaign in 2004. And Favs and I hit it off. And he hired me in 2007. And I was just kind of stubborn enough not to leave until 2021. But it illustrates the point that Carolyn was making, which is, I'm very well aware that I've had every advantage in my life just by virtue of who I am. I had parents who could pay to send me to a good college and, help me while I was finding that first job in Washington. Then I went to a good grad school and, I had a bunch of connections, like Stephanie. And not everybody has that. It's a very difficult industry for speechwriters of color to break into, let alone the White House. But we didn't have enough when we were in the White House. We had 4 women in our second term team, but we only had one speechwriter of color. And it was a hard thing to try to find too, because there just aren't that many. And I talked to President Obama about this too, and he said, yeah, it's because the system's not set up for it. So there are people trying to change that now in a way that wasn't true 20 years ago when I first broke in. There's a group called Speechwriters of Color. You see more and more members of Congress paying their interns rather than expecting people to do free labor right out of college. And in a shameless plug for my own speechwriting firm, Fenway Strategies, we try to hire as many speechwriters of color as we can.
So if I can add one thing to that.
Yeah, please.
This is really important. And what Cody said is absolutely on the spot correct. It is difficult to break in because you don't have those contacts. But if outreach is done, you might be able to find people. And I'll give you this little bit from when I was at the White House. Somebody in a senior position said to me, probably not thinking, I think all the president's speechwriters should be white Southern men because then they'd have his voice. And I thought, what an interesting thing to say to me. So I said, that's a great idea. Can you also arrange for all of his audiences to be white Southern men too? And so, so that shut that down pretty fast. And I think it gained a little bit more respect for the idea that you need different perspectives at the table. Diversity isn't just color. It isn't just race. It isn't even just language, or it's a lot of things. It's coastal, it's Midwestern, you have to have people, if you're trying to talk to this great nation, you have to have people who have experienced different parts of it at the table, because you're going to miss so much otherwise. And Cody, I know you're a Chicago guy. I'm from the Chicago suburbs on the Indiana side where I'm living now. I think that helped a lot. John, you're from Wisconsin. I think that probably helped a lot. The perspective that you brought to the White House.
One quick question for Carolyn. Someone writing in with a question, dreams of being an ambassador. This person has dreamed of being an ambassador since age 12. How do you get to be an ambassador? There's the easy way and the hard way, but I think it's all hard ways.
Well, there are 2 paths. One is you join the State Department, and good luck in passing all the testing there, and then working your way up this tremendous bureaucracy. It's huge. And getting noticed. And by the way, they've had a problem too of not a lot of diversity among their ambassadorial ranks. So there was that. Or you know the president, and you might even be a big donor. And because I had been a journalist all those years, I never gave a red cent to a politician. I had not. So when this is funny, when the Senate got my nomination, Paul Coverdell, the late great Paul Coverdell, a Republican out of Georgia, who was just the kindest and smartest gentleman, invites me in to meet me because he couldn't understand why the president was nominating his speechwriter. And so we talked. I completely, I researched everything. So I researched a lot, and he had been head of Peace Corps. And so I was able to talk knowingly about what was going on in Belize with Peace Corps. So you have to have a certain amount of knowledge about a part of the world, and you have to be able to communicate with people effectively, and you have to be able to advocate for US interests and for people in that nation who have that US passport. Evacuating people from hurricanes, I did that. Going into the jungle with US troops and, for joint exercises in the jungle. And, and I break out in heat rash, but I did it because I thought it was important. And the guys before me, by the way, had not, the prior ambassadors, I was told. So you have to be willing to do a lot of stuff to get this. And if you give the impression you can do, if you know the person who is naming these ambassadors, as I was lucky to, and the offer came to me. I was asked, what are you going to do in the second term? And I said, I don't know, you can make me an ambassador. And I had in my mind Belize, and it was available. And that's pretty much how it happened. I had been in the Caribbean before as a manager for a worldwide news organization called United Press International. And so all the pieces fell together. And I was very lucky. Lots of people got mad because they said they had been in line for Belize and they did not get it. I did.
Sometimes you just have to Bigfoot. Another question from the audience. How do you deal with writer's block on the job? Are you allowed to have writer's block if you're a presidential speechwriter? Cody, you're shaking your head.
No, there's no time. I mean, I don't really believe in the concept because I think writer's block suggests that there's the perfect speech in your mind and you just have to find it somehow. I just start writing, I'll write. All right, what are we going to say? What's the story here? I'll try to write the entire speech in like a minute, in 100 words. What are we saying? And then that's what the revision process is for. Once you kind of have a basic structure down, then you really start working and playing with it. And that's when the speech kind of comes to life. I can't tell you how many times I've changed a speech entirely from the first concept. But, writer's block too, I find the most important thing is actually to talk it out with somebody. And that's where, we were all lucky enough to have teams around us. I had a writer named Terry Zuplat who was in the room next door in the West Wing. And if I was ever stuck, I'd go in there and start talking to him. And sometimes I'd figure it out in my head before he even said a word and just say, thanks, man, and go back to my desk. So I think writer's block means, you're kind of stressing yourself out by thinking that you've got that perfect speech in there and you just need to start it. You need to get it all down immediately. You don't, it's a process. So, just start banging away. And if it doesn't work, you'll eventually get there.
I think of what the actor, I think it was Alec Guinness, said to a young actor who said, well, what's my motivation here? How do I get this right? And Guinness said, your motivation is your paycheck. So having been a journalist all those years and working on deadline, I just knew that I had to have that job and I was going to get the work done no matter what. And you have to bring some of that. It's not always going to be your A game, but you give it the best that you can at that time.
John?
Yeah, I agree with both my colleagues. If I can't write, it's always the same problem. I don't know what my point is. If I know what the point is, I can write it. And so that's what the problem is going to be. I'm not intimidated by the blank screen. Some of the best thoughts I ever heard on writing were from the late, sorry to say, great Charles Crownhammer. And he said that he had a weekly column in the Washington Post every Friday. And he said he always dictated his column. And he sat back and just dictated it. And it was transcribed. And it was too long and it was disorganized and it was repetitive and all the problems you would have in a situation like that. He said, but I'm not writing, I'm rewriting, I'm editing. And so he had something in front of him. And so Cody makes a good point. Just get something down. Just get going on it. And if there are a few ragged thoughts, if it has the nature of, if it looks like thinking aloud, well, that's okay. You don't have to show it to anybody. Just get something down, and your thoughts and your insights will really start to take shape.
Another question, once a speech is agreed upon, is there training? Are there rehearsals? How much practice is there? And I have to ask Carolyn, because I understood that President Clinton was notorious for like changing things, like basically while it was in the teleprompter.
Oh, never happened to me. So
I roll.
So he could, but he could also read it 100% almost as well. I mean, it was a mixed bag, but I just think that you don't have ownership of this speech. It belongs to the president. And I think whatever the president wants to do to it, he can. Rehearsals for States of the Union, absolutely. Convention speeches, national addresses that way, sometimes. But it's more than anything, you have to be able to channel the voice and the thinking. It helps to have access, as we were able to in our White House, so that you got the voice down.
Yeah, rehearsals. John and Cody, what were they like?
President Bush would rehearse big speeches. He didn't use the teleprompter very often. He maybe 6 or 8 times a year. But for the big ones, the State of the Union being the prime example, he would have rehearsal sessions really close to the day. They wouldn't be a week or two out in front of the event. He would read the first draft aloud to us on a big speech like that. Speechwriters would gather in the Oval Office, and he would read the speech aloud. But then, as the date of delivery drew near, he would do those practices. There's a movie theater in the East Wing of the White House that goes back, I guess, to the Eisenhower era, and it's like a regular movie theater with a ramp of seats. It's just small, and that's where the president they'll set up the teleprompter and the lectern, and if you were involved in the speech, chances are you'll be there for the rehearsal. Kind of an interesting thing to go through.
Same answer for us.
Yeah. Did President Obama also use that same movie theater?
No, he used the map room, which is on the same floor but in the middle of the residence, and we set up the same podium and the teleprompter screens where he wanted them. And he'd do it once on State of the Union Day around 5:30 that evening, and then he'd go have dinner with his family and shower, pick out a tie. Sometimes he'd ask us which tie we liked better during speech prep. And then he'd drive to the Capitol, and he'd always listen to Eminem's "Lose Yourself" on the way.
Really?
That was his ritual, yeah.
I mean, it is a good hype song.
It's a great hype song.
It is a perfect hype song. It's on my run list. So
there's a YouTube somewhere of him doing it backstage before the 2016 convention speech on speaker.
And that was not an isolated incident.
No.
So another question here, and this is fun, and Carolyn, you alluded to this, but how do you handle it when a president dislikes what you wrote or wants to go in a different direction or, uses a lot of marker?
So I had an incident actually in Boston, my memory of Boston. We flew up to do a speech at Northeastern University, and I had not been told there was no air conditioning in the gym. And the mother of the kid being saluted that day had a heart condition. So, and to make matters worse, the White House travel office decided we would take a small plane. They were trying to show the US public that we were saving money by not taking the big 747. So I was cut from the manifest to get on that plane. I had to argue my way onto it to talk with the president. I get there and I realize the speech is way too long. This woman may have a heart condition and we can't. So we get downstairs, finally, we get on the ground, and I'm literally cutting, pasting, stapling, and putting it together. And I hand it to the president, lightning fast, as fast as I could. Watching me the entire time was John Kerry, who was laughing. When I looked up, he said, earned your pay today, didn't you? So the short answer is you do what it takes to make the president like it better than it was.
Yes, my motto it always was, I've repeated it many times, where there is no alternative, there is no problem.
You know, when you're a younger speechwriter, at least for me, when you see a bunch of edits on the page, you think you've done something wrong. But eventually, within a year or two, I realized actually you're doing something right. You know, with Obama, like I said, he viewed it as a collaboration. And if he'd start editing on the page, it means he likes what you gave him and he can work with it. The worst times, unfortunately, there weren't too many, is when he'd, call you up to the Oval and say, sit down, and there wouldn't be any edits on the page because he actually wanted to take a different direction. But even then, he would spend time, he'd sketch it out on a legal pad. He'd tell us where he wanted to go and why. I mean, he always, and that's what a writer does, he'd always take the time to explain to us why he wanted to say the things he wanted to say, if we'd done something wrong, what we needed to change, or just where he wanted us to go with it. So once the pen came out, that actually meant you're on the right track.
Couple more questions because we started a little bit late, and I'm sorry, Cody, that this means you're going to get to finishing your book a couple minutes later. But some good questions here. Do speechwriters confer with each other across administrations for perspective? Were you guys already on speed dial?
I didn't do a lot of it. I mean, you don't do it while you're there, but or in my experience, I check with other speechwriters, how do you do this or that? But you get to know them. You meet them at social events, and you have something, regardless of who either of you work for. It's an instant bond of friendship I've found that you make with speechwriters for other presidents.
There's something called the Judson Welliver Society. It really doesn't exist anymore. Judson Welliver being the first White House speechwriter. And it was formed, the society, by the old Lions, Bill Sapphire, Jack Valenti, Arthur Schlesinger. And to hear their stories, we would meet once every, I think, other year. And to hear their stories was really quite inspirational on what was done during those times and how they handled situations, and just wisdom that they would impart. All continued, of course, to be, active in writing beyond their White House years, and that was inspirational too.
Carolyn, at one of those dinners, Ted Sorensen said that he said to you Bush speechwriters, he said, you're not the first presidential speechwriters who have the experience of dealing with your boss's father. And told about Ambassador Joe Kennedy calling him up and telling him, Ted, the average American is worried about inflation. And he said, Ambassador Kennedy, you're the last person who's going to tell me what the average American is thinking.
That's good. John, I don't know who it was, but somebody at the end of the Bush administration left John Favreau a really nice note when he took over. So I tried to keep the tradition alive and left a nice note for my successor. Apparently got lost with the pandemic playbook. I don't know.
Oh,
You set that up.
Yep. And I imagine you guys did review speeches, like big speeches, as you were writing yours, or looking for inspiration, or probably checked back with Lincoln every once in a while.
We did. Oh yeah, all the time. But we did, in our first year for sure, when we didn't know what we were doing at certain events. It's like, what does a president do on Memorial Day? What does a president say on X day? We'd go back and look at, both the Bush and Clinton speeches, see, what they usually said. But, for foreign policy speeches, we'd look back at Kennedy a lot. President Obama would guide us to certain presidents at certain times. In September 2008, during the campaign, when the economy fell apart, he told us specifically, go back and look and see what FDR was saying to an anxious nation. When we started having troubles with Congress in 2010 and 2011, he said, go look at some Truman do nothing Congress stuff. He'd guide us to certain places.
Well, I think that we will leave it there. And I just want to thank all three of you. This has been so wonderful. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope our audience enjoyed it half as much as I did. So John McConnell and Ambassador Carolyn Curiel and Cody Keenan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thanks so much, Tamara.